All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to give people a minute or so to trickle in, and then we can get started. All right, we are so excited to see you all again and to hear from our amazing panelists today, Rabbi Shoshana Meira Friedman, medicine woman Melissa Tantakidjan-Zobel, and Imam Safet Abid Katovic. We are grateful to our many sponsors, which we will copy in the chat for you to see. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Rabbi Shoshana Meira Friedman is a writer, mother, and climate activist in Boston. She serves as the Director of Professional Development at Hebrew College and as a rabbinic ambassador for Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. Her song, The Tide is Rising, which she co-wrote with her husband, Yotam Schachter, has spread as an anthem in the climate movement. Thank you so much, Rabbi Shoshana. So I will begin with our first question today, which is, in Judaism's evolving relationship with place, which can be an understanding of, the land of Israel, our Jewish customs or Jewish texts, or, living in diaspora, what role do you think a strong sense of place has in promoting regenerative relationships with each other and the planet?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a total delight to be here. And I am here on Wampanoag land in Boston, Massachusetts. So it's a really rich question. And I want to begin with acknowledging that we have a 2,000 to 2,500 year tradition in Judaism of longing for homeland. And there is a specific piece of land that we have longed for, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And of course, there are various and intense, complex, and at times liberatory, at times very problematic manifestations of that longing in the modern world. For me, as a Jew who has spent my entire life, other than a year of it, where I was in Israel, the whole rest of my life, I've been in the Boston area. And this is my homeland. This is the land that I feel deeply rooted to. I took my first steps here. I know the seasons, and I take the longing that we have, that I've inherited from the Jewish tradition of longing for Eretz Yisrael, for the land of Israel. And for me, it has become not to the exclusion of a relationship with Israel at all, but as a spiritual practice. When I pray the words which are in daily liturgy, lead us upright to our land, I notice that in a very rabbinic way, we look very closely at text, that liturgy does not actually say, lead us upright to the Holy Land or the land of Israel. Of course, that is what the authors of the liturgy intended, for sure. But it actually just says, which means lead us upright to our land. And for me, I have a practice of stomping my feet on the ground when I say those words to remind myself that I am asking God to bring me home here to the land I live on. To be led upright to our land, I want to say, means rising before her as we rise before an elder or a revered teacher, wherever we may live. And that means noticing, learning local ecology, and becoming, as it were, and I say this with great humility and with only in the words of Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose writings have deeply impacted my life, and she's from the Potawatomi Nation and a botanist, and she talks about the project of becoming indigenous to land. I'm very aware that my ancestors are not indigenous here, that I benefit every day from white supremacy and from the legacy of colonialism. And so I always want to be careful about using the word indigenous in any appropriating sense. I do want to experiment with using it in the spiritual sense of what does it mean to live into indigeneity, meaning I'm here for the long term. I'm here in an invested way. I'm here in a way that my relationship to the land is about the long game, and not one of extraction, but one of relationship. And the last piece I will say about this question, which I love so much, that as a Jew, I've inherited the narrative and the lived experience of exile. But in the age of the industrialized global economy, I want to say that those of us who are not on our ancestral lands are twice exiled. We're twice exiled, once from the lands of our ancestors, and then once again, most of us, from the land where we actually live. And that we spend our days in the physical exile of indoors and the spiritual exile of an extractive economy that is viewing the earth, other human beings, and all other life forms as resources to colonize or extract, instead of teachers, elders, and beloveds, the relational way of viewing the world around us. And the Hasidic masters in Jewish tradition teach us that longing itself is a doorway to God, that the longing itself is a form of devotion and connection, even though it bespeaks a sense of distance. So my practice is to notice my longing for home, and to follow where it leads me, which for me is to my backyard and to deep, real personal relationships with the trees and the plants there, and to teach myself and my son all I can about the land on which I live.
Thank you so much for that. That was really beautiful. And I love this, the idea of the twice exiled. And I think that connects really well to our next question, which is that in the Jewish calendar, this year is a Shemitah year, which could be a potential option to change up that, our habits in kind of like being enclosed in these indoor spaces. So for everyone, the Shemitah year is a year of rest for agricultural land in Israel. And I would love to hear from you. What do you think Judaism has to say about restoration and environmental crises?
Yeah, thank you. So just to expand on that, for those who don't know, Shemitah is a Hebrew word that means literally to release. The English translation, it's usually translated as sabbatical, though that isn't the exact translation of that particular word. And the book of Exodus teaches us that we are to, in the land of Israel, plant for 6 years and be farmers for 6 years and gather in crops. And then during the 7th year, leave the land alone, withdraw from her, and that the needy among us will then be able to eat just as everyone else, and whatever is left over is eaten by animals. And so I want to say a couple of things. One is that Shemitah was almost certainly never practiced in the ancient Near East, at least not as, we have no evidence that it was. The other is that it is practiced today in Israel, but I would say not in the way that excites me, and I'm going to leave the politics of that aside. What it is really exciting for diaspora Jews who are invested in I just was listening to a Robin Wall Kimmerer last night on a beautiful YouTube post from a few years ago, and she talked about restoration as restoration. And so I want to say, yes, this is about land restoration, and there is a massive actually movement in North America of Jews farming again, and that back to the land history that we saw in the kibbutz movement and in early Zionism actually becoming a diasporic movement of regrounding ourselves in the local ecology where we live, wherever we are in the world. And so there's dozens of Jewish farms all over the United States that have really meaningful relationships to land and that practice Shemitah in their own way. But that what we are really talking about here is a restoration, telling a different story about who the land is, who we are, and what our relationship is with that land, which is much deeper than just saying, I'm not going to till and toil in the field. What Shemitah values ask us, and this is where we're excited as a modern progressive Jewish community, what Shemitah teaches us a number of really important things. The first is that ecological well-being and human well-being are connected. Right away, that text says, you're going to let the land rest and the needy will eat. So we see the theme already in our ancient texts that we know is so critical today around climate justice and all kinds of environmental justice, that never, ever has environmental been a niche issue, and that was a terrible way to frame what is, of course, the most globally important and intimate of any issue, which is the actual space in which our bodies live. And so human well-being and the land well-being are intimately connected, that if not the very same thing. So that's one piece of the restoriation that Shemitah asks us. The second is that we learn with Shemitah that the land also rests in the same dance pattern as God and as humans. So our textual tradition, our sacred story teaches us that when God created the world, God did essentially a dance of work, 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 rest. 6 units of work, 1 unit of rest. And that we are then asked to do 6 units of work and 1 unit of rest. And it's a dance. And if I were in a classroom, I would show you the dance that my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Nehemiah Polin, taught me around this. The land rests then in the same rhythm. And so this to me teaches us that we have a triangle of relationship of the sacred, of humanity, and of land largely defined that are all dancing the same dance, which also means we are in some sense the same, either the same thing or in the same body of energy. And then the last piece I want to say is, of course, that Shemitah has this important threat to it, which is Leviticus 26 says that God is threatening, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to scatter you among the nations, and then the land will take her Shabbats. Then the land will rest from all the Shemitah years that you did not let her rest. This isn't optional. This kind of relationship, we are going to find a sustainable level of existing on Earth. We are going to find it because we live within physics, and there are constraints. The question is simply, how much pain do we go through before we get there? And the land will rest. The land will restore herself. She doesn't need our help, of course. What she needs is for us to be able to step back enough to be in relationship, to know what our place is in being in right relationship with her. And that to me is the most exciting part of Shemitah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Shoshana. That was so beautiful. I will now pass it over to Ross, who will introduce our second speaker.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me? Am I good to go? Great. Yeah, I'm honored to introduce medicine woman Melissa Tantakidjan Zobel. She's of the Mohegan tribe and was trained in Mohegan traditional knowledge by medicine woman Gladys Tantakidjan, who lived to the ripe old age of 106. And Melissa currently serves as her tribal nation in the traditional role of medicine woman and tribal historian, in addition to her job as cultural media liaison. She's the author of Medicine Trail, The Life and Lessons of Gladys Tantakidjan, on the life, spirituality, and environmental perspectives of her great aunt and mentor, Gladys. So say welcome, and I will ask the first question here. What is the special power or regenerative force of spiritual communities that are connected to the land and rooted in a sense of place? I'd love to hear your perspective on that, as someone who's residing on the ancestral lands of the Mohegan tribe.
Well, thank you. Kuwikwasin. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. It's nice to be here in this wonderful company. I really didn't expect, Rabbi, that you were going to talk about Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I'm so delighted that you did. And kind of we can just continue with some of those thoughts. You're curious about spiritual communities rooted in this. Is this the first question, rooted in a sense of place? And by that, do you mean spiritual communities in the sense, and this was one thing I just wanted to clarify, do you mean spiritual communities in the sense of, what do you mean by that? I guess is what I need to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the essence of a spiritual community is kind of defined by those that engage with it. I think it's hard to, I don't mean for this to be unhelpful, but
No, it is
just-
an interesting question, right? And it's a particularly interesting question for Native Americans because there are no non-spiritual communities. Part of what we do, we don't have a separate church, right? We don't have a separate synagogue. We don't have a separate temple or any place to worship separately because the land is the temple, right? And so a spiritual community traditionally would have been any community. And so that's why it's a tricky question. And it's interesting in terms of regenerative relationships. That does not mean that they're always good regenerative relationships these communities have with the land. But in terms of what that relationship is, in many ways, the reason we don't have a choice about our relationship to the land has to do with our language. So the Algonquin language is a fascinating language because, first of all, there's no gender in it. How modern is that? We have animate and inanimate, right? But we also have a situation where animacy and personhood is not just for humans, right? It's for, and not just for plants and animals, and not just for fungi, it's also for many things: rocks, the earth, the ancestors, they never die, they're always alive. So the earth's way of being referenced in the Algonquin languages is so active and alive that it makes it very difficult not to take it into consideration. So one of the things that colonialism did in Algonquin speaking territory, which is where I am right now on the Mohegan Reservation in Connecticut, it tried to eradicate those languages, right? Those languages which had these very deep-rooted connections. And by deep, I mean that in our language, your land, well, I'll give two examples. Your nation is connected to you, kind of like your feet are connected to the ground, but your land is connected to you like your arms and legs are connected to your body and you can't really remove them easily. So a lot of this has to do with thinking about the words we use. And the reason I think that's important, I think, you know, when we talk about indigenizing, and I can't think of the exact term you used, Rabbi, we also have to think about terminology so much, right? That's so important to what we're doing. And one of the things I was always aware of growing up is place names. You know, New England is kind of a funny place because you'd think that the place names would have gone away with the native people, but they didn't exactly. There are a lot of native place names, right? And why is that? Well, I think it's because they were helpful. For instance, Misquamicut, which some of you may know is a great beach, means the place where the red fish run. So you knew you could get salmon there, right? Or Quinnetucket, the land of the long tidal river. You knew what you were in for. You were also going to be running into clams, quahogs, wampum when you hit this tidal river. Eagles are referred to as the white-headed bird that fishes on the river. So you know what their function is. So there were no places that were named after conquerors, or there were no places that were named after individual human beings. The places were recommendations and descriptions of how the land could be cared for, what should be there, and if you don't see those red fish when you get to that place, you would know there's a problem, right? You would be immediately alerted to the fact that something is wrong, that the usual course of events is not transpiring. So we're trying very hard here in New England to restore native languages. Some tribes have kept them all along, especially in northern New England. Southern New England, there's a lot more restoration. The Wampanoags have been a great exemplar of that with the work of Jessie Littledoe, who's a MacArthur, Genius Award winner for her restoration work. She works with the Mohegan tribe also. And our last speaker died in the early 20th century. And my great aunt Gladys, who was my mentor, knew her. But children were beaten in school for speaking the language, and so and thrown out of school often for speaking the language. So the languages were really tamped down. But fortunately, Fidelia kept diaries in the language, and that's a whole nother story that we could talk about another time. But back to this idea of how can spiritual communities rooted in a sense of place promote regenerative relationships with each other and the more than human world, I would say become aware of those place names. Try and find out what you can. Because the easy answer in New England is, well, so much has been erased that it's hard to do. Well, that should be a clue. Whenever there's erasure, that means that it's important to find out why and what was erased, and what we can learn from it. And so language is definitely one way. The other thing you can do, and this is a little more complicated, is you can not just look at place names, but you can also look at plant and animal names. And food sovereignty is another thing. What traditionally grew in a place, right? New England had so much corn that in the King Philip's War, scholar Lisa Brooks says that it was used as barricades. Now just picture that, okay, in the 1600s, barricades of corn. So this was a place that traditionally grew, the Three Sisters from here up through Iroquois country. And corn was the great sacred plant. In fact, I recently read I'm trying to think who said it, that corn is almost America's, we think of monuments. What should we make a monument to? Maybe we should make a monument to corn. It's our real gift to the world, isn't it? From a food standpoint, it's our great American natural resource. And so think about what was eaten in a place. Think about what was traditionally harvested and grown, because it was done so with a sustainable world in mind, right? So it may have changed, but there's that. So that's the first question. We got to do the second question too. So I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, really beautiful. To bring it back to Robin Wall Kimmerer, I remember in Braiding Sweetgrass, she has this passage where she talks about how her language is what the plants and animals are used to hearing, the words for those things, which I just thought was a really cool concept. So to kind of build on that, how can we build these sorts of communities that are doing this work of learning the names and learning relationships with the humans and all the other beings that they live with?
Well, the first thing to do when we talk about the restoring, right, is to unlearn the stories that aren't correct, right? A lot of what we've been taught in New England, particularly, the last of the Mohegans and the Mohegan tribe, that's a personal favorite, right? We, we grew up with a fictional tale of genocide, of our greatest chief having no children when all of us are descended from him because he had about 6 wives. So it's not a true story. It's definitely something that was made up. It's a place where understanding the stories of what happened in a place and understanding the land acknowledgement of a place. You're on Quinnipiac land. That was a terrible story of colonization and destruction of a people there in New Haven. It can still be felt there. Learn about the tribes that were there, learn about their stories, learn what really happened to them from the tribes themselves. And that's the best way to do it. And I think that helps build ecological communities because it shifts our focus to an older, or rather a different way of seeing the land. It doesn't have to be an older way because there are many indigenous communities now that see the land the same way. So a different way of seeing the land and putting the land in a different position where it and us and everything on it is a unit. We often say we are all connected, and it's a trite native expression, but by we mean everything from the stars, to the rocks, to not just what we would consider here in modern society living beings, that of inanimate beings. I did actually have, I'm going to read you something very short, a description that I wrote for Marge Bruchek's book, Savage Kin, as a foreword of reciprocity and kinship and the way we can look at something to restore that in our hearts and minds when it comes to the land. And the tricky part I think you'll find is it's not just one or two things you have to do. It's a coupling of many things, right? It's a process. So I'll give you an example. Consider the moccasin flower. sometimes referred to as the lady slipper, a plant indigenous to Algonquin territory. For the flower to grow, a rhizocotonia fungus must feed the seeds. Later, the same fungus extracts nutrients from the grown plant for its own food. Young bees enter a space they can escape only through a tight spot under the stigma, leaving behind some pollen and carrying more to sister plants. Flora, fauna, and fungi work together in reciprocity to survive. Once the plant flowers, it takes the shape that Algonquin people recognize as an eastern woodland center seam moccasin. Mohegan children then learn from their elders not to transplant or pick this flower because it is storied. Not only is it beautiful and delicate, it grows in the territory of the little people of the woods, known in the Mohegan language as the Makiawisug. In Mohegan tradition, the Makiawisug wear these tiny moccasins, and they can shapeshift into whippoorwills and other beings. They can also grant your wishes, and if you're terrible and bad, they can freeze you and take all your belongings. So stories surround behaviors, right? Don't pick this flower. It's fragile, it's delicate, and here's why. And storing beings like this plant offer lessons about the ways indigenous people root in the world. The moccasin flower teaches many things. Of course, it teaches that all beings are related and that to survive and procreate, we have to live in reciprocity with fungal, floral, and faunal kin. The lifeway of the plant connects humans with other or more than human beings. And lessons like this explain how you can be linked to multiple kin. Now, for myself, I am directly linked to flora and fauna. The Mohegans are the wolf people. So we are wolves. We associate with wolves. We follow wolves. We want to become wolves. Wolves are, very faithful. They're very loyal to the group. I'm also Osawano, which is the flower, that's my traditional name, that grows on the corn plant before the corn. It also, in our language, it technically is translated as change, or the thing that can change over time. So you have to be adaptable to change. And you're teaching people that, yes, you must be like the plants. Plants can evolve, they can change. Plants have been genetically modified by native people for a long time in very different ways than we do it now, but they've always been modified. Corn came from it was mated with other species of corn. So in indigenous worldview, plants and animals and people and other beings, ancestors, they're all linked as kin. We're all family. When you consider something family, you sacrifice for it. You do more than you would normally do if it's not family. We show up for our family when we wouldn't show up for someone else. We have to look at everything as family. And if everything is family and is seen as a provider to you and you a provider to it and a shared responsibility, it's helpful to the environment. But again, stories and notions, very much as my sister, the rabbi, said, need to help us do that, because that's how people learn and that's how we grow up and into these kind of understandings. I think you're on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's just so many great insights about different ways of knowing the world and knowing our relationship to it. So we're going to go ahead to our third panelist that Jenna is going to ask the question for. So take it away, Jenna. And thank you so much, medicine woman Melissa.
Great, thank you so much. So I will now introduce Imam Safet Abid Katovic, who has his MBA and is a longtime U.S. Muslim community organizer / activist and environmental leader. He is the new chair of the Parliament of the World's Religious Climate Action Task Force and serves on the Parliament's Board of Trustees and has recently been re-elected as treasurer. Imam Safet also serves as a member of the advisory group on Islam at the Yale Forum for Religion and Ecology. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I think we'll begin with our first question, which is we would love to hear what you believe is the role of interreligious and interfaith partnerships in environmentalism.
Thank you so much for those kind words of introduction, Jenna, and wonderful to be with you all. I'm sorry it was a little bit late. It's our Friday prayer services today, and I'm actually coming to you from another Algonquin speaking area, which is by the Potomac here in the DC area of the Piscataway Nations and other nations as well. So just finished the Friday prayer service actually in the mosque that I'm in. They're currently going on. They have several services today. So Jummah Mubarak, happy Jummah, happy Friday to all of you. Blessings of Friday, and wonderful to be with you, our dear sister Melissa and my dear sister Shoshana, as well as our brother Ross. Thanks to GCRE for GCRE, is it, for organizing this gathering, and for all the various departments. So it's really amazing the interdisciplinary nature of the forum and the departments. And I didn't have a chance to hear it, but you know, keep at it and keep going. Kudos to all those graduate students who had a chance to present papers at this forum. It's a good thing to do, but just make sure you finish the degree. Okay, that's my advice. That being said, peace and greetings. Salam alaikum, shalom alaikum, peace and blessings to you all. And that's sort of like a start. Interfaith means we need to know each other's languages. We need to have a common language. And I think the environment, the natural world, provides us with that place where we can find commonality. Sometimes religions have, and religious institutions over the centuries have been characterized as those institutions that are at the core of war and conflict, etc. And I don't think historically this is totally accurate, but definitely religions have played a role. We do have religious dialogues. Often they are monologues of 3 different people, there's 4 different people in the same room. We do have our Thanksgiving get-togethers, those kumbaya moments where we share Thanksgiving dinner, or maybe a Seder meal, or maybe a iftar in the mosque, and we do have those moments. But life continues, and the fact of the matter is life is endangered of continuing, given the climate emergency that we're facing. Time is really running out. And one of the quotes that I like, that I remember, and I sort of want to tie this into this idea of interfaith, is Thomas Berry was asked what he stood for. And he says, "What I stand for is what I stand on." Often I find that people that are having discourses, dialogues / arguments from different traditions at one another, talking at one another, they are doing so from a place in which they're both standing. And it is a place that is connecting the 2 of them together, or the 3 of them, or the 4 of them together. So this earth that we share, that we are a part of, that we are connected to, is that common ground. We always talk about finding common ground, but actually the earth is the common ground. And I saw something amazing in 2014, having been part of different types of religious interfaith dialogues over the years, and multi-faith dialogues of different forms and modalities. And that was in 2014, we had the coming out of the environmental declarations on behalf of religious communities. So you had Laudato Si, which was, of course, the most famous of Pope Francis, but then you had the various faith communities coming out and religious communities coming out with their doctrines on the earth, with their statements with regard to the earth and responsibility, moral responsibility for us as human beings, specifically the members of their congregations, with respect to the earth from their religious teachings. And here's what happened. I was involved in working on one of those declarations, which was the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. And Laudato Si, we like to say that we began a declaration before Laudato Si went public, which was true. But Laudato Si, in terms of its structure and its format, all of us sneaked a peek at it to say, how do they formalize and structure this? I had conversations with our friends at Union Theological Seminary, and they were working on a similar doctrine, as were members of the Buddhist community, a similar statement on the environments, sort of the coming out of the climate statements on the environments by religious communities 2014. And they were saying, you know what, we didn't know exactly what to use in terms of language, because we do within our religious traditions, within our spiritual traditions, have, and I think this is much more pronounced, of course, among the First Nations people on Turtle Island and the indigenous nations of Turtle Island. But the Abrahamic faith traditions, we do have those gems, but they were not brought out and described and discussed in modern eco terms or eco understandings. And so this was sort of like a process of excavating in a good way, of digging down into the earth and sort of reclaiming that language, those understandings in the light of what is happening today. And I found out that the Buddhist community and Hindu communities were also struggling with. So the Buddhists, as they were putting their declaration, they said, Safa, we never said this before, but when we came out with our declaration, we sort of looked at the Islamic declaration to see how you guys formulated it and brought it together. And so what I'm speaking of here is this sort of this incredible ability of religious communities when faced with this new crisis, and it is a global crisis. It's going to affect all religious communities. And of course, it affects those who are most vulnerable, those who are hit first and worst and have done least to bring about the crisis amongst us. They are not the fossil fuel burners. We are the fossil fuel burners. We here in the first world, we here in the United States, we here in China, we here in Russia, we are the fossil fuel burners. And this language of coming together found itself expressing itself on the streets. So for example, 2014, we saw the famous climate march, the People's Climate March and the climate movement. And you had present the members of the various faith communities now not just talking at one another, but walking hand in hand with one another and with the other groups from civil society that were present. The environmentalists were there, the scientists were there, the next geners were there, and a whole list of folks were there walking together and demanding that the governments and those in the halls of power take account of their actions and make a difference in a real way for the future generations. And I think that coming together was one of the reasons, and especially of the religious communities, was one of the reasons that the Paris Agreement came into existence. If you take a moment to think about it, before then, there were some dialogues, there were some conversations, there were some statements here and there by the religious community, but not such in a public, in-your-face type of way. That set the stage for the Paris Agreement to come into existence because, in a sense, religious communities and Native peoples were already doing this for a long time, indigenous peoples are doing this for a long time, but they had a megaphone. Laudato Si and the Pope has a megaphone. It was allowed us to provide a way in which we could say, this is a moral issue. This is an issue of faith. This is an issue which, if you don't address it, your eternal soul, to the extent we have some control over what happens to someone's eternal soul, is in danger. And so I think that inter-religious dialogue is able to materialize because we're not fighting over land, we're fighting over the possibility that our children will have a land that they can live on, have food that they can eat, have air that they can breathe, and have water that they can drink without getting sick. And so this sort of becomes like a new area of common ground, literally speaking, that we can all stand on and stand together. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really amazing to hear from your own personal experience with interfaith work on this issue. So you talked about this a little bit as well, but our next question has to do with how do you think environmental protection, the environmental justice movement, and climate action bring together diverse religious and spiritual traditions? And I'd also love to hear a little bit about maybe how these movements bring people together within your own faith.
Well, movements for me are about people, as you mentioned, and it's about relations. But framing of the movement and the relations in the people, especially when we're speaking about the earth, has to do with, first and foremost, our relations with the earth. So this idea of resetting, restoring, reclaiming the proper relationship with the earth, and therefore with all who reside upon the earth, all who are fed by the earth and cared for by Mother Earth, is something then that becomes critical. So it's important that the religious communities, faith communities, religious traditions reclaimed that heritage and that relationship in a way which is, I think the word was symbiotic that our sister just used, the idea of mutual reciprocity, that we, in order to live, there's an African word from the times of South Africa's movement, Ubuntu. We are people to people through people. You know, I am who I am because you are who you are, and we are who we are because we're connected to one another. And so what affects one affects the other. But from a Muslim perspective, part of the theology has to do with sort of this reclaiming of the idea that the earth is sacred, and it was already present within the tradition, but was not understood in ecological language or in an ecological way. The earth is sacred. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said the entire earth is a mosque, al-kulluha masjida, and wherever you are, you can pray upon the earth. So if you can pray someplace, it's a sacred place. But the thought going into that, I said, well, what does that actually mean? We have a structure called the mosque, and we have sort of this great mosque, which is the earth herself. But what does it actually mean? Well, it means that everyone then who is upon the earth, who resides upon the earth, becomes members of our congregation. So, I mean, if you think about it in terms of when we're sitting in the mosque on the rugs, or you're sitting in the pews in a church or in a synagogue, or whatever the case may be. And once again, I'm sorry, I'm from the Abrahamic faith tradition, so I'm leaning in that direction in terms of my examples. But that you look to your right and you look to your left, you will not be surprised to see a fellow human there. You'll be surprised to see a squirrel there, or a raccoon, or a tree growing inside the structure. You will be surprised to see that. But if the entire world is a mosque, that means all of those are part and parcel of our congregation. All of those are intelligent creatures in their own way. All of those have the ability to worship God. And there's a verse in the Quran specifically about that communities other than human are organized into social groupings. They're able to worship and praise God in their own ways, which you don't understand, but they're able to do so. So we have this sort of, we have to reset the relationship with the earth. And then that interfaith aspect of working together for justice, I think, becomes more doable, because we connect to one another through the earth, and the earth is connected to all of us, and all then are connected to the divine. So it's sort of this sort of type of relationship. Now, in terms of climate justice, one of the things we're learning is that racial justice, racial justice, social justice, economic justice, and you go down the list of issues of justice, they're all impacted by climate justice. If something is happening with regard to racial inequities within America, cities, within structures in which people are living, within the ways in which the economic system is favoring one group over another group, be sure, and it is certain, that that is exacerbated by the changing climate. So climate change exacerbates all of these issues, and they're all intertwined. We can't fix one without the other. You can't speak about racial justice without climate justice. You can't speak about climate justice without speaking about issues of pipelines, and the list goes on. They're all interconnected together. And so what I've seen here in the DC area, as I've been here just a short time, is an incredible coming together of all of these various movements for justice that heretofore have been separate and apart, but now are sort of merging together. And people are marching, which Rabbi Heschel used to say, we pray with our feet, right? People are praying with their feet, they're marching, they're doing so in areas that normally they weren't involved in because of this intertwining of all of these issues of justice. So I see sort of that type of coming together. And I think the issue of climate justice is also something that can be very physically experienced, because we feel the changing of the weather. We experience it. It's not something that is foreign to us. And I think that this ability to experience it collectively, and recognize also that when you're speaking about extreme weather events, for example, they do not, in the mosque, that's why you hear in the background the azan for the next Friday prayer service starting, but you will not, the extreme weather events don't stop at a postal zip code. They go beyond it. I was in California last week, and I was in the areas that are supposed to be the areas where you can't afford to buy houses, and if you're even a rich person. And I noticed the remnants of the fires in those areas. The trees themselves had the blackened ash upon them. It didn't stop. It didn't stop those fires from spreading. So, and a lot of people lost a lot of wealthy people who thought the zip code would protect them, believed that they were special, separate and apart from, realized that the environment and Mother Nature and Mother Earth are in pain, and that pain is expressing itself in ways that are harming all of us. So I think this idea of justice movements have come together, recognizing they're becoming intertwined, and you can't really solve one without the other. I don't know if that helps answering the question, but.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And now I will hand it over to Ross.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our speakers. I feel like we got a concurrent, that all of their messages came together, but they were also coming from different backgrounds that, gives that diversity of thought, which is what we need, I think, to solve our problems. And to close, I just wanted to highlight an aspect of something that you've all spoken to, which is the relationality between all things. And that's, even between the rocks and the water, or the people that are doing this work. And I think that's just a really beautiful analogy to how our ecological systems work. Everything is related, and to do the work that needs to be done to keep the whole biosphere running, they need to be working together and aware of that relationality. And I think our three speakers did a wonderful job at that. So thank you so much. I'm going to drop in the chat the next student presentation round, those links. So please, to our attendees, join one of those rooms so our next round of student presenters can get started. But thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you so much for attending this panel, to our attendees.